Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was never going to be a popular move with many of her political counterparts, nor indeed perhaps with the Education Secretary she recently fired. Theresa May has shown an appetite for a battle that may well get the grassroots Conservatives on her side, but huge swathes of the educational establishment and Parliament lie against her. Today, she insisted the grammar schools she envisioned were a thing of the future, not the past. She called for faith schools to grow and, in a shot at the sector of privilege, demanded more from private schools in return for the tax breaks they get from their charitable status. Chris Cook, whose film yesterday anticipated many of those fine details of today's speech, asks if she's chosen a fight she can win.
When she first arrived in Downing Street, Theresa May said she didn't want to lead just a Brexit government. And she won't. As part of a broad education package today, she pitched new grammar schools.
I want to relax the restrictions that stop selective schools from expanding, that deny parents the right to have a new selective school opened where they want one, and that stop existing non-selective schools to become selective in the right circumstances and where there is demand.
New grammar schools would require new legislation, but it's far from clear the government has much of a majority on this in the House of Commons. They certainly don't have one at all in the House of Lords. Now, lots of that opposition to this idea comes from the experience and evidence from the old grammar system and the remaining grammar schools. That's perhaps part of why Theresa May was so keen to stress these new grammar schools will be something else altogether. They would, for example, be required to take a certain number of poor children. That would help with the main concern about grammars, that they hurt the poor. One chain of grammars does it already, but it's tough to implement.
Right. There's a lot of work involved to persuade parents that a grammar school education is right for their children, and we've probably been more successful in doing that in some of the Asian parts of the city than the more white working class areas. And that's not because of the ability of the children, it's more that the outreach probably has to be more intensive.
Academics remain sceptical, though, about this idea.
The poor kids are going to do reasonably okay in the 11 plus are not a sort of random sample of poor kids. They're probably poor kids from family backgrounds that are good in some way, supportive families, very interested in education, very possibly from immigrant backgrounds, for example, and kids that would probably do quite well in the system anyway. Now, rather than have the schools benefit from the presence of these good, intelligent, motivated poor kids, they're going to be taken out of those schools and put into these elite schools, leaving behind all of these other kids who would benefit from interacting with them.
For far too many ordinary workers.
That wasn't the only big idea. The so-called 50% rule is set to go, an admissions rule for faith schools that discouraged new Catholic faith schools in particular.
The 50% rule means that if you build a new school and it's full, it's oversubscribed, you are not allowed to select on the basis of religion over 50%. For us, that means that if we build a new Catholic school in an area where there is demand from parents for a Catholic education, we then have to turn 50% of them away because they are Catholic. And that neither makes sense, nor does it fit in with our charitable trust deeds under which we operate and the canon law of the Church.
I have always been relatively relaxed about faith schools, but I have to say in the last few years I've become more nervous about an expansion of faith schools, and I think anything that encourages more segregation, I think is not to be encouraged. So I am nervous about those proposals, and I think there'll be a lot of people in the House of Lords nervous about those proposals.
The speech also contained a commitment to force private schools to help state schools with a bit of a threat.
Through their charitable status, private schools collectively reduce their tax bills by millions every year. And I want to consult on how we can amend Charity Commission guidance for independent schools to enact a tougher test on the amount of public benefit required to maintain charitable status.
Now, you might be quite surprised to hear Conservatives having a go at private schools. After all, the party has historically defended their interests. But the private schools are in a historically unusual place. If you look at the Independent Schools Council website, you can see they proudly record the lowest fee increase this year since 1994. But it's 3.5%. That's a lot. The average cost of a private sixth form this year is £21,000 a year. The private schools, once bastions of the bourgeois people who made up the Conservative Party spine, they're now havens of the ultra-rich.
Thank you.
The speech contained plans to push universities to help schools as well, but all of those other changes together won't generate as much heat as the idea of selection.
If you look at the last 15 years or more, there's been a group of people, maybe even 20 years, there's been a group of people across the parties who've actually been really determined to try and move the whole school system up. And at times that's been really controversial and we've taken quite radical decisions. But there's been a lot of consensus. I think this has I think there's a real expectation that this will break the consensus. And actually I think that's a real shame, because I think it's been very important to schools and to teachers and to head teachers that they feel there's been a broad level of support behind the changes that have been moving forward.
The May plan for schools faces huge obstacles, principally Parliament. But whatever comes now, one thing is clear. Things changed when the Prime Minister did.
Chris Cook there. Well, let's talk now first about the policy and then the politics of all this. With us now, Patrick Derham, headmaster of Westminster School, one of the top independent schools in the country, and the Conservative MP Mark Field, in whose constituency that school lies. Also here, Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, and Philip Collins, chief leader writer at The Times. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks very much for coming in. Mark, I'm going to start with you because we heard from Nicky Morgan tonight, the woman whom your party charged with the nation's education until July, calling these ideas at best a distraction from crucial reforms and at worst undermining 6 years of progressive education. This is pushing things backwards in her.
Things have moved on, and
since July.
Well, they've certainly moved on as far as Nicky Morgan's concerned, haven't they? So, she's no longer in position, and we've got a new Prime Minister with a passion for getting a great meritocracy forward, as she rightly put it. And personally, I take a view that we've seen over the last 20 years prominent politicians of all political parties utilising this in a rather sort of crude calculation in the way they look at intervention. One of the great things I think about this speech from Theresa May is it comes from the heart. She's very passionate. There's a very authentic sense of where she sees education needs to be. And what has changed since the 23rd of June is that we're now in the throes of removing ourselves from the European Union. I think that it's very easy to try and say this is old Tory battles, ideological battles coming back again. I think it's fundamentally different.
But what hasn't changed is the evidence, if you'll forgive me, that suggests this hurts the poor. As you heard in Chris Cook's piece, this leaves more people behind than it takes with it.
The biggest, most important thing to recognise is that our very brightest children from the poorest households have a special educational need that too often is not being looked after within the state sector. We look at special educational needs as if it is simply a matter for those who have educational difficulties. Actually, this is something like fundamental. I look in my own constituency. In London, the results have been pretty good. I don't deny that.
You
for
don't
1
need
minute.
grammar schools at all.
We absolutely do. I mean, if you ask Chinese families, Bangladeshi families in my constituency, they would like nothing more than to see the brightest and best. And as I say, the change that has taken place since June is that we are now in a world, a very competitive world out there. China and India, big nations going forward. And those who want to invest in the United Kingdom, companies for the future, will want to see a properly, fully educated, competitively educated workforce. Elitism and excellence should not be bad words in the way that I feel they have been far too often in this debate over the past 2 decades.
Did you hear elitism or excellence as a bad word when Theresa May was talking about what the private sector must do now, and that little threat dangled over your heads about charitable status?
No, not at all. And I think the clip that you showed from her speech doesn't do justice to what she was saying about the independent sector. I think she recognised the huge contribution that the independent sector are making to the issue of social mobility, which is a real concern for myself personally, but also for all my colleagues. And she recognised that we are part of the solution and not the problem. And I've argued for a long time that we need to change the debate and to be looking much more critically at what's going on. And the interesting thing for me is she picked up on capacity and capability of some schools. She recognised there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to this, which I think was really important. She recognised there needed to be a degree of proportionality, that not all schools are the same. And there's a mythology about, there's a mythology about the independent sector and the type of pupils that go to them. And I think she recognised that by what she said.
She did also, though, in a sense, remind people that these schools of immense privilege have charitable status for tax breaks. And a lot of the public will be saying, why on earth are they getting those tax breaks?
But because we are contributing to the greater good in all sorts of ways. Let me just give you some examples. She name-checks Westminster and the pioneering work we're doing with the Harris Federation, with the Harris Westminster Sixth Form, which is terrific. She name-checks Eton, but not all independent schools are like Westminster and Eton. And the important thing about...
So what do you think? You think there is room for many of them to do more?
No.
Some are a lot smaller and they haven't really got the capacity necessarily. They haven't got the huge playing fields
The overwhelming proportion of independent schools are involved in effective partnership. There are all sorts of different ways that this can happen. It's not just the sponsoring of academies and free schools. It's not just the provision of bursaries. That was all the talk back in 2010. But on the subject of bursaries, look at the groundbreaking work of schools like Manchester Grammar School, King Edward School, Birmingham, are doing pioneering work with fundraising and really reaching out to underprivileged members of the community. Look at the work of the Arnold Foundation, which started at Rugby, which has given birth to Springboard, a national charity of state and private boarding schools, raising aspiration amongst those most in need of that type of education.
You raise a really interesting point, and does it surprise you, Anne, that it is a Tory Prime Minister stepping into this debate?
This particular one on private schools, well, I think she's trying to do a number of things, and one thing that might end up being very difficult for her is the complexity, the sheer complexity of that speech today. I mean, going back to the Tory DNA on grammar schools, very brave, very bold, but not so difficult for her to do. You could see she clearly believes it. She's a beneficiary herself of the grammar school system, and she believes that she can deliver more meritocracy through it. And a lot of people will doubt that, but she will get a chance to make the case. I think what she wants to do, because her whole pitch, if you like, as Prime Minister after David Cameron, who was a bit of a posh boy as much as and was often seen as
it's about not being
was
David
not
Cameron.
Being like that. So this trying to engage the private sector more and turning the screws to an extent on the private sector is something that I think should be serious about. And I have to disagree a little bit with Patrick. I think there is a lot more room there. I think that some things, particularly the expansion of the academies chains, private schools often got involved, and sometimes they walked away when it got difficult. I think a lot more, they will find their feet will be held to the fire to deliver a bit more. And that may be no bad thing.
And Phil, it is weird, isn't it, for a second, to say, you know, all we've heard about for the last 6 years of a Tory government is academies and free schools, and suddenly everyone's on board behind Theresa May and grammar schools are the rage.
Yeah, it is a big change in rhetoric. The first half of the speech was real boilerplate. Every Prime Minister makes that speech after a few weeks. They all talk about meritocracy, equality of opportunity. Everyone's done it. The second
Did you write that one for Tony Blair?
I've written that speech too, yes. I didn't write the one today, though I could have done. It was more or less cut and paste from things I wrote with a bit of less rhetorical flourish.
So modern. I knew that was coming.
But the second half of the speech wasn't as good as that. The second half of the speech, because when you get into the policy things, I think there are some problems buried in there. I think it's going to be very difficult to do, actually.
And you're talking about grammar schools particularly?
I'm talking particularly about grammar schools, and I think that's partly the politics within Westminster, the Parliament rather than the school or the constituency. But it's also, I think, the politics of grammar schools are in fact difficult over time. Any policy which takes 20% of the people and says, your school's better than the other 80%, the arithmetic of that is not good politically.
Well,
Can I just go to an educationalist for 1 second?
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me about her speech was the things that she didn't say. There needs to be much more about the crucial thing, which is that the data on education demonstrates that the key thing isn't school structure, it's actually the quality of the interaction between the teacher and the pupil. There are all sorts of surveys that point to that. The real issue facing this country and quite a lot of the Western world is the issue of teacher recruitment, teacher retention and the quality of teaching, and that's really important. But I also think what she didn't talk about was that I'm not convinced, and I think we need to take a step back and think is tinkering with school structures actually the answer? And I think the real issue for me is that too often governments in this country have bought into schools can fix it mentality, and I think there's a real problem with that.
I think there's an issue about trying to empower parents. It's giving the choice there. And if there's one thing that was not particularly touched upon, but I think will be touched on more, is this issue of technical schools. The idea that actually it isn't 80% people being left behind.
It's a very technical process, though, where you share grammar schools with a lot of other people. But I want to touch on the politics more, Anne, and this is about the question of mandate. Where does this come from? And who supports it?
Well, I think we know that a lot of the Conservative Party support it. In fact, it's a bit like a lost territory. They've been dying to regain it, you know, and she's bringing it back.
It doesn't mean she can win it.
Well, the mandate question, if you want to be, you know, the technical understanding of it, if it is in terms of how the Lords will view it, as if it wasn't in the manifesto, then her right to overrule is very dubious indeed. I am a bit more sympathetic to her, indeed to any government that changes after such a disruption as Brexit and a change of leadership in the Conservative Party. She's not going to get up there and do a David Cameron.
So basically, you can do what you want. Are you saying this is a massively fresh sheet and you can just do what you want
if you can get away with it?
In constitutional fact, you can do what you want. Yeah,
there is
no constitutional requirement to seek an extra mandate. In my view, there should be.
So you don't think this is part of a ploy to bring forward an election if she loses?
Well, I doubt it is, actually. No. In my view, I think she'd be well advised to have an election for all sorts of reasons. I think she could completely crucify the Labour Party, and she could gain the majority that I think she may need to get some of these things through.
She doesn't have any of the votes to get this through.
No, I think she will have the votes to get it certainly through the Commons. The Lords may be more problematic, but I think one of the reasons that the independent schools issue is being brought up here, and I think we will put some more flesh on the bones about technical schools, as I've just said, is it will be part and parcel of a broader picture on education, as opposed to being just driving grammar schools through.
I think you're so confident that you can get this through. I mean, you've got an awful lot of people who remember, and we heard from Michael Wilshaw, the excellent head of people who run a great Hackney Academy in his case, but part of that great Academy's push. You heard from Sally Morgan there in the Lords for Labour. A lot of people have committed years of their life to the Academy's programme.
Unless constituents actually start to express
and a lot of Conservative ministers and politicians also were more committed to the Academy's programme. There's no mention of it. There's no mention of where it leaves that. That's a bit problematic in the Commons.
I don't think there's any sense of
We're just wrapping up.
I don't think there are many votes in it, because I'm not convinced there'll be many schools who will actually go for it. The conditions for doing the grammar school bit are quite onerous. I'm not convinced there'll be many schools actually find it that attractive.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Emily.
I've been getting away with